I'd like to welcome all of you here and commend you for taking the decision to participate in this event in the face of blanket censorship by the entire political and media establishment and the lies and falsifications being circulated to vilify and isolate Julian Assange. This rally has been organised by the Socialist Equality Party, the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Party, as part of our ongoing fight to free Julian Assange. It is being live streamed internationally by Facebook and YouTube. Today there will be 5 speakers. After they have addressed the rally, I will be making some important announcements, so please stay if you can until the end. My name is Linda Tenenbaum. I've been a member of the Socialist Equality Party leadership for 4 decades, and I'll be chairing today's event. Just over 1 year ago, on June 17, 2018, the SEP held its first rally in defence of Julian Assange and the courageous whistleblower Chelsea Manning. At that time, we raised the demand of the then Turnbull government that it immediately exercise its diplomatic powers and legal discretion to repatriate Julian Assange back to Australia. In the years since, the government, along with Labor, the Greens and the crossbenchers, have not lifted a finger, despite their clear obligation to represent the interests of this journalist and Australian citizen. And they have kept their mouths firmly shut. Today, we are circulating to everyone here a statement containing a call to action, published by the World Socialist website International Editorial Board. It is entitled, "For a Worldwide Campaign to Prevent Julian Assange's Rendition to the United States, for the formation of a global defence committee to secure his freedom." I urge you to read it, take it home, and study it carefully. If you don't have one, they're available, I think, on the table at the back. This call makes clear that the situation facing Julian Assange could not be more serious. He has been charged by the United States Department of Justice with 17 offences under the American Espionage Act. Together, these charges attract a penalty of 175 years in prison and potentially the death penalty. The British government has already set in motion the legal procedures for Assange's extradition to the United States, which is due to take place next February. That will be after he has spent a 50-week sentence on an entirely manufactured charge in London's notorious maximum security Belmarsh prison among murderers and gangsters. Right now, his health is failing fast, and there are concerns among his family, friends, and legal team that he could die. Assange's life, make no mistake, is in real danger. The imperialist governments involved in his persecution, Australian, American, British, and Swedish, bear full responsibility. Ever since he sought political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London in 2010, they have escalated their filthy vendetta against him. They are determined to silence, break, and destroy Julian Assange for exposing their war crimes, lies, and conspiracies, and also to intimidate any other honest journalists, other honest, principled, investigative journalists and critics who continue to insist on their professional duty to expose the truth. Julian Assange is the first journalist to be indicted under the Espionage Act. If he is extradited to the United States, all those depraved politicians in that country who have demanded his blood over the past several years since the release of the explosive Afghan war logs, records of diplomatic conspiracies, and the collateral damage video, will almost certainly push for the death penalty. The Espionage Act charges themselves open the floodgates for the prosecution of any journalist in any country who falls foul of the US government to be similarly charged. Now, just as the ruling elites have escalated their persecution of Julian Assange, our response must be to escalate the fight for his freedom and that of Chelsea Manning, who has been imprisoned indefinitely in the United States for courageously refusing to give testimony against Assange. This is why the World Socialist website, the political voice of the International Committee of the Fourth International and its affiliated parties throughout the world, call for the formation of a global defence committee which will coordinate the fight to bring Julian Assange's persecution to an end. As the statement insists, the will to fight must be converted into political action, mass political action. This Defence Committee must now be established. The International Committee and the WSWS will be at the forefront of its creation, and we welcome and seek the participation and commitment to the development of this initiative from all progressive, socialist and left-wing individuals and organisations in this fight. We do not require or expect that those who join this committee will agree with all aspects of the political views and program advanced by the WSWS and the International Committee. We understand that there will be a wide range of positions, excluding, of course, those of the political right, among those who join this Defence Committee. The only requirement for membership is an unconditional commitment to the defence of democratic rights and the recognition that freedom for Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning depends upon the building of a mass popular movement from below. In other words, this Global Defence Committee must be oriented to arousing and mobilising the international working class, the overwhelming majority of the population, and the most powerful social force on the face of the planet, to defend the democratic rights of Assange and Manning and the democratic and social rights of all workers. This campaign will require the organisation of protest actions on an international scale, including meetings, demonstrations, rallies, and public conferences. It will require transforming the latent solidarity of millions for Julian Assange into a conscious political movement guided by a global perspective that links the fight to democratic rights, to the defence of democratic rights, to the growing struggle of the international working class against capitalist exploitation, political oppression, and war. There is an objective basis to our confidence in this campaign's success and victory. It lies in the rising tide of international class struggle that is now underway, and which provides the powerful mass foundation for the struggle to achieve Julian Assange's and Chelsea Manning's freedom. The growing worldwide strike movement of teachers in the United States, Poland and New Zealand, wildcat strikes in Mexico, the mass general strike in India, mass movement in Algeria and other African countries, the indefatigable yellow vests in France, and the recent multi-million demonstrations in Hong Kong all testify to the determination of ordinary people to fight for their fundamental civil liberties and social rights. The next 8 months between now and February will be decisive. The fight to free Assange and end his persecution must now be taken to a new stage. I urge all of you here to consider carefully these issues and to sign up today to join this Global Defence Committee in this critical and historical struggle to secure Julian Assange's freedom. Thank you. I was now going to introduce Mark Davis, who is one of Australia's foremost journalists. I'll introduce him shortly, but unfortunately today he was not able to attend. He has a very young daughter who is ill and he is required to look after her, and he sends his apologies. But he has also sent us a brief contribution, which I'll read in a moment. Just to let you know who Mark Davis is. He's one of Australia's foremost journalists, having won 5 Walkley Awards, including the prestigious Gold Walkley. He has been a senior journalist for SBS's Dateline program and the Australian Broadcasting Commission's Four Corners. In 2005 to 2007, Davis reported on the US trials of Australian Guantanamo Bay detainee David Hicks. In 2010-11, he was one of the few Australian television journalists to conduct extensive interviews with Julian Assange in London. In 2014, he conducted a fascinating interview with Christopher Boyce about the 1975 Canberra coup and the activities of the CIA in the Australian Labor movement. I'll now read you his contribution to this rally. I deeply regret not being able to make it today and am grateful to all of you who have come. Only a movement of ordinary Australians can save Julian now. It is becoming clear that Australian journalists and media will not promote his cause for their own, often bizarre reasons. But all of us can and should object to an Australian being dragged in chains into another country on contrived security charges. Extradition was meant to be for murderers and drug lords, not truth-tellers. The attacks on Assange are an attack on each of us and on our political sovereignty. Assange doesn't need lawyers and journalists to defend him. He needs his fellow citizens and his government. Hopefully that movement will build before it is too late. Our second speaker today is Australian documentary filmmaker James Ricketson. In 2012, Ricketson was arrested in Cambodia, where he was making a film about poverty-stricken families in Phnom Penh. He was falsely accused of spying for unspecified foreign states and incarcerated in Cambodia's notorious Prey Sar prison for 15 months. Found guilty after a 3-week trial in August 2018 and sentenced to 6 years jail. Human Rights Watch Asia condemned his jailing as a, quote, politically manufactured farcical plot. Abandoned by the Australian government for months, he was eventually returned to Australia in September 2018 after being pardoned by Cambodian authorities. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Just to correct one little error, I wasn't arrested in 2012. I was arrested in 2017 on the 2nd of June. But I'd like to begin by making an observation about how I started my day early this morning as the sun was rising. I went online and I saw a brief story about Donald Trump and Mr. Putin joking about getting rid of journalists and about fake news. And my first response was, wow, this is amazing. This is going to be front page news today in the newspapers, or at least page 3 news. I went out and bought the Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald and found that there's no mention whatsoever of this conversation between Putin and Trump. The main story on the front page was that our Prime Minister, it seems, is agreeing with Donald Trump to go to war, if necessary, with Iran. Let me just start with this, the question of being a journalist. One of the arguments that people have against the defence of Julian Assange is that he's not a journalist. Well, I'm here to say that I'm not a journalist either. I'm a filmmaker, and I have been since 1972. But between 1972 and now, about 45, 46 years, I have written several articles that have been published in different magazines and newspapers. I have actually had 4, 5, 6 different blogs in which I've written articles of the kind that investigative journalists write and publish. I've never really made any money out of being a journalist. However, when I was arrested in June 2017, one of the main reasons for my arrest was my journalistic work. In other words, I was arrested because I'd been a critic not just of the Cambodian government, but also of several non-government organisations in Cambodia. Now, the reasons for my arrest are complicated, and I don't need to go into them in any great detail, but I would like to at least outline what the Australian government did and did not do for me. First of all, I was twice, since 2014, dragged into court and charged with defamation for having written articles that certain NGOs in Cambodia deemed to be defamatory. I was not invited to appear in court. I did not know about the court proceedings until after I'd been sentenced. In each case, I was sentenced to a deferred jail sentence and a substantial fine. The first I heard of each of these court proceedings was when a journalist called me and said, "James, what's your response to the court verdict?" To which I responded, "What court verdict? What have I been charged with?" Now, in both instances, I actually appealed to the Australian government to do something to help me, to safeguard my human rights, to insist that the Cambodian government explain why it is that I could be found guilty in court twice and not be either provided with any evidence of my guilt or even invited to the court case. In neither case did the Australian government do anything to help me. So leap forward to 2017 when I was arrested. I received advice from both the Australian Embassy and from various lawyers and other people that were involved behind the scenes in trying to get me out, that the best thing for me to do was to lay low, to keep quiet, not to criticise the Australian government, not to criticise the Cambodian government, and to allow quiet diplomacy behind the scenes to secure my release. I agreed to that on the condition that if after 4 or 5 months nothing had happened, I would then begin to kick up a bit of a fuss. I was in the very fortunate position of being in the media and having quite a few friends in the media, so I knew that I'd be able to generate some publicity for my cause. What happened to change my mind about keeping quiet was that a fellow Australian by the name of Giuseppe Nicolosi, who was in Presa prison with me, and who'd received a 7-year jail sentence, despite the fact that there was no more evidence of his guilt than there was that I was guilty, became very ill in about September, October 2017. So ill, in fact, that I and various other prisoners wrote to the Australian government, to Julie Bishop, to Malcolm Turnbull, and to the ambassador to Cambodia, Angela Corcoran, basically saying that Giuseppe, who we called Zippy, was very ill and needed to be repatriated to Australia and put into an intensive care ward because we feared that he might die. We received a message back in writing from the embassy basically saying, that is not our responsibility. This is the responsibility of his family, it's not our responsibility. A few weeks later, Zippy died in jail, basically, of dehydration, malnutrition, and medical neglect. If you Google Zippy, you'll find that there's no mention of him basically online. He was an Australian who died totally unnecessarily and not helped by the Australian government. That's when I began to think, well, the same thing could happen with me. If there isn't a media outcry, if the Australian public doesn't get behind me, the same thing could happen to me and I could wind up on page 3 as, in a small article about Australian filmmaker dies in Presa prison. Now, at the same time, there was another driver for me, and that was that in the lead up to the elections that took place in June last year, my face and my name were used by the Cambodian government in propaganda to suggest that I, along with the opposition party and the CIA, had been complicit in a plot to overthrow the Cambodian government. I wrote to the Australian government, from Malcolm Turnbull downwards, saying, please, can you at least ask the Cambodian government not whilst there is an investigation into my guilt or otherwise, and before I've even been to trial, ask them not to be publishing this kind of propaganda. The message I got back was, this is a matter for you and your lawyers to take up with the government. In other words, we're not going to do anything. Now, I mention all of that because I think that I was an embarrassment to the Australian government. They realised, as did everybody, that I was not a spy, that I wasn't guilty of any crime at all, including flying a drone. It was not against the law when I flew the drone, but that's a small thing. On the one hand, the Australian government didn't do anything to help me, but come March of 2018, after 110,000 people had signed a change.org petition, and after various journalists had written extensively about my case, and after Philip Adams had mentioned my name several times in the media, it was clear to the Australian government that I was a potential embarrassment, that for me to die in Presar prison, as Zippy had, would be a public relations disaster. Now, there may be other reasons why the Australian government then decided to intervene, but it did in fact intervene behind the scenes. I can't and won't go into any real detail about what the government did behind the scenes, only to say that it was effective. Let me put it that way. Now, in the case of Julian Assange, it may well be that without us knowing it, there's a good deal going on behind the scenes, that our government is in fact trying quietly and diplomatically to help Julian. We can't be sure that that's not happening, but I suspect that it probably is not happening. And so, in order for the government to feel under pressure, what is required is that a huge number of Australians begin to realise not just that Julian Assange doesn't need to be, or should not be in jail, should not be extradited to the United States, where it's highly likely that he will die in jail. That's not the only issue. The other issue is that if Julian Assange is extradited, that sends a chilling message to all members of the Fourth Estate. What it means is, just to give one example off the top of my head, let's just say for argument's sake that between now and the US election in 2020, somehow or other, the ABC's Four Corners came into possession of a tranche of documents that implicated Donald Trump, say, in criminal activity. Would the ABC risk putting together a Four Corners program that might result in, and these are secret documents, might result in producers, directors, and others involved in the program in being extradited to the United States? Now, that's a very, very crude example, but I think that we are in real danger of, if the precedent is created of Assange going to jail in the United States, we're in real danger of creating a precedent whereby investigative journalists will think twice about doing the job that they should be doing, that publishers will think twice about publishing that material. And I know that I would think twice about it also, having had the experience of being in jail. I don't really want to go back there again. And if I myself came into possession of such documents, I would really think twice about whether or not I wanted to publish them. Whereas before I went to jail, when I was, I suppose, relatively fearless and cocky, I wouldn't have thought twice about that. So my recommendation is to the people that are here is, first of all, talk to all of your friends. Try, the next time there's a rally such as this, and there will be next Wednesday actually at the Town Hall, try and bring at least one friend along. Acquaint yourself with all the facts relating to Julian Assange, which I'm sure other people will talk about. Make sure that you have answers to the difficult questions that people might ask you about Assange, because most people And some of my best friends who are intelligent and reasonably well-informed people wind up spouting to me statements about Assange that are clearly the result of them having ingested propaganda. So all of us need to be able to answer all the questions in a sensible, logical and calm manner. And hopefully between now and February, there'll be sufficient Australians who feel not just outraged at what's happening to Julian Assange, but also very concerned about the ramifications of his jailing, such that there will be tens of thousands of people in the street or at demonstrations the next time round. I just want to make one more final observation, that is that back in about 1968, I became involved in the early demonstrations against the Vietnam War. The number of people at the demonstrations was not dissimilar to the number of people that are at this demonstration now. And it seemed as if there weren't very many people that were concerned. Eventually, it got to the point where there were a couple of 100,000 people in the streets, and that's what we should be aiming for. But I think, in addition to telling all of your friends, I think somehow or other we need to engage young people in the Julian Assange dilemma in the same way that the young people have become engaged now in the climate change dilemma, for want of a better word. And on that note, I think I will shut up. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Our next speaker is Oscar Grenfell, a writer for the World Socialist website and author of regular articles on Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning for that publication. He is also national convener of the Socialist Equality Party's youth movement, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the IYSSE. Oscar stood in the seat of Parramatta during the recent federal election. Together with our other House of Representatives candidates in Oxley, the Hunter and Cornwall, our 4 Senate candidates in Sydney and Melbourne, he placed the defence of Assange at the very centre of our election campaign. No other candidate or campaign raised a word about Julian Assange in that campaign. Please welcome Oscar Grenfell.
Thank you. We're here today to take a stand against one of the most monstrous political witch hunts in modern history. To find any parallel with the persecution of Julian Assange, one would need to go back decades to earlier periods of war, social upheavals and authoritarianism. Back to the First and Second World Wars, when governments around the world, including in the US and in this country, imprisoned anti-war journalists, imposed military and police censorship, and banned socialist and left-wing organisations. The attacks against Assange are the sharpest warning that amid a drumbeat for war today and the resurgence of social and political opposition from the working class, governments are once again turning to these blunt instruments of political repression. We're rallying a little under 3 months since Assange was snatched from Ecuador's London embassy by the British police on April the 11th. That act was itself the culmination of an international conspiracy spanning more than 8 years and involving the governments of the US, Britain, Sweden, Ecuador and Australia. In flagrant violation of international law, they trampled upon the right to political asylum, one in centuries of struggle against despotism and tyranny. The brutal arrest of Assange shocked and appalled millions of people around the world, but the governments involved have only responded by stepping up their attacks on his fundamental legal and democratic rights. Assange was immediately convicted on bogus bail charges, despite the fact that he had forfeited bail monies, had been detained in the embassy 7 times longer than the maximum sentence for that minor offence, and was exercising his legal right to seek asylum in 2012. He was denounced by the presiding British judge as a narcissist and told to voluntarily hand himself over to the US to, quote, get on with his life. Now, Judge Michael Snow was only one representative among many of a British judicial system determined to show that the norms of due process and a fair trial do not apply to Assange. Last month, the US unveiled its full indictment of the WikiLeaks founder, including 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act. This was an absolute vindication of Assange's warnings since 2010 that he faces extradition to the US, where he would spend the rest of his life at the mercy of the war criminals and the CIA torturers he's done so much to expose. The use of the Espionage Act against a publisher and a journalist is the most significant attack on press freedom in American history. It's nothing less than an attempt to illegalize any exposure of government crimes and to create the conditions for journalists anywhere in the world to be dragged into an American prison for publishing the truth. Despite his deteriorating health, Assange is being held in the maximum security Belmarsh prison alongside individuals convicted of murder and terror offences. He's been denied access to a computer, a library, legal documents, and virtually every other means of preparing his defence. Already within 3 months, the British government has green-lighted extradition hearings for next February. They'll be held in a kangaroo court presided over by Judge Emma Arbuthnot, whose husband is a reactionary Tory politician. He has worked in the security and arms industry alongside the former head of MI6 and other representatives of the deep state. James Arbuthnot features in WikiLeaks publications more than 50 times. In other words, Assange is to be tried by those who he's exposed. As Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, has stated, the British hearings are only the latest legal travesty to be perpetrated against Assange over the past 8 years. Melzer found last month that the WikiLeaks founder has been the victim of psychological torture. The UN official's words should be repeated. He stated, and I quote, "In 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonise, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law." Melzer rightly said that the Australian government was complicit in the torture that has been inflicted upon Assange. It must be stressed that without the support of successive Australian governments, the campaign against the WikiLeaks founder could not have proceeded as it has. If any of them had fulfilled their obligations to defend him as an Australian citizen and journalist, Assange would not be sitting in Belmarsh prison and facing the prospect of rotting in an American jail. It should never be forgotten that it was the Greens-backed Gillard government that began this criminal collusion in the persecution of Assange. When senior American politicians were calling for him to be assassinated for exposing their war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, Gillard denounced WikiLeaks as a criminal organisation and pledged to help the US intelligence agencies destroy it. That's been the line of every government since. When Assange was arrested, Coalition and Labor politicians declared that they'd provide him with unspecified consular assistance, committing them to nothing. But their real attitude was captured by the images we saw yesterday of Scott Morrison arm in arm with Donald Trump, who wants to imprison Assange or execute him. And it should be stressed, it would be no different if it was Shorten or Albanese in Morrison's place. But it's not just the major parties. The Greens have issued weasel words expressing their supposed concern over the prospect of Assange's extradition to the US, but they buried any discussion of his plight during the federal election. Instead, they were busy calling for yet another coalition with Labor. The Greens, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, the trade unions and the pseudo-left are complicit in Assange's persecution. They're trying to keep the public in the dark and they're opposed to building any genuine campaign to secure his freedom. That's why they've boycotted every event in Assange's defence, including this rally. All of these organisations, which once claimed to defend Assange, have abandoned him. They've lined up behind the Swedish frame-up over supposed allegations of sexual misconduct. Even though the preliminary investigation in that country was dropped twice, Assange has never been charged with a crime and no evidence has been presented that he committed one. Many of these political forces have openly joined the camp of imperialist war, cheerleading the regime change operations in Syria, Libya and the Ukraine, which WikiLeaks has exposed. The Australian media has also covered itself in shame. Peter Grester spoke for many of them when he responded to Assange's arrest by declaring that the WikiLeaks founder was, quote, not a journalist. Now, these arguments, which line up with those of the Trump administration and the CIA, boil down to the fact that Assange is not employed by a multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate and that he exposes government lies rather than repeating them as the corrupt corporate hacks do. These media figures are representatives of what John Pilger aptly described as Vichy journalism after those who collaborated with the Nazi occupation of France in World War II. With a torrent of lies and misinformation, they've aided and abetted the persecution of Assange and created the conditions for unprecedented attacks on press freedom. The federal police raids on the ABC and Arnica Smethurst demonstrated that corporate journalists cannot have one rule for themselves and another rule for Julian Assange. Either they oppose all attacks on the media, including WikiLeaks, or they pave the road to a police state. Most of the media pundits and chiefs, however, have made clear that they have no problem with the jailing and persecution of journalists so long as it does not impact upon their own lucrative operations. This week we had the obscene spectacle of senior media chiefs coming together to declare the importance of freedom of the press. The very same week, all of them refused to publish an opinion piece by Nils Melzer defending Assange and exposing the lies used to justify his persecution. Now, there will be no fight for democratic rights from these quarters. They are the corrupt tools of the state. As we've stressed, the defence of Assange and of Chelsea Manning must be based in the working class. That is, the vast mass of the population which is entering into major class battles against austerity and war. Millions rightly view Assange as a hero who is being persecuted for exposing the truth. But their sentiments must find organised expression in a globally coordinated campaign. It's abundantly clear that the Australian government will only take action to defend Assange if it's forced to do so by mass pressure from below. Therefore, this rally must be a starting point for a broader campaign in the factories, in working class neighbourhoods, at university campuses to mobilise workers, students and young people in Assange's defence and to build the mass political movement required to secure his freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oscar, for that very, very clear speech. Our next speaker is Professor Stuart Rees, who spoke at our previous rally at this venue a couple of months ago. We are very appreciative of the fact that he has travelled quite a long distance to get here today on time, despite the rigours of the journey, and are very pleased that he has agreed to address this rally. He is an academic, a committed human rights activist and author, founder of the Sydney Peace Foundation and Emeritus Professor at the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. A special welcome to Professor Rees.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for being here. I'm going to try and be brief, but I want to argue one thing, namely that we are all subject to a process of slandering somebody. We're all subject to a labelling process that tries to define some people as villains, even as criminals, and other people as heroes. So I'm going to give you a contrast between the treatment of Julian Assange as a villain and hero And by contrast, I'm going to mention Professor General Jim Molan, who was commander of the US and Iraqi forces in Iraq, in particular at the siege of Fallujah. You're already familiar with the slander against Julian, the labeling of him, first of all, as somebody who wasn't even a very tidy guest in the Ecuadorian embassy. Secondly, as somebody whose WikiLeaks cables identified people and put their lives at risk. And yet the people who have read those cables, in particular Professor Fernandez in a book called What Uncle Sam Wants, show that he didn't put anybody's lives at risk. He didn't identify particular people. And even the Defence Force report from the Australian government said that with regard to Afghanistan, the WikiLeaks cables comprised no Australian soldiers. Then you've also heard Oscar referring to the charges against him, even as a rapist. That label, that image persists apparently in the Australian public mind. And yet the Anne Ramberg, the president of the Swedish Bar Association, said the whole conduct of that case had been deplorable. And a couple of weeks ago, a district court judge in Stockholm dropped the case and said, enough of this, that's the end of the matter. So there's some of the accusations against Assange. The last one, of course, is this repetition that he's not a journalist. And the self-important Peter Grasta, in a sort of trade demarcation dispute, keeps repeating that sort of exercise. The wonderful editor of Crikey.com, Bernard Keane, said, if you think that Julian Assange is not a journalist, then you'd have to disbelieve all the secrets that he's revealed. You'd have to say that nothing about the carnage in Iraq and Afghanistan is simply not true. Let me jump now to the other business of labeling as a way to depict somebody and come to General Jim Molan, who a few months ago was a Liberal senator in Canberra. He was in charge of the siege of Fallujah, a city of about 400,000 people. In a new book about that siege, there are two concepts used. One is sociocide, which is the destruction of a whole way of life. 6,000 people were killed. The other concept is ecocide, the complete destruction of an environment. In that siege, every kind of weapon was used. The US forces admit to using illegal weapons, in particular white phosphorus. It burns women, it burns children, it kills indiscriminately. And yet, Molan and company are regarded as heroes. The incidence of genetic damage as a result of what happened in Fallujah is appalling. The pediatricians in the Fallujah General Hospital, in their data, they show a huge incidence of appalling defects. And refereed journals in epidemiological journals show that the genetic fallout from Fallujah was worse than what happened after the dropping of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. So on the one hand, you have Assange as a villain and a criminal. He killed nobody. On the other hand, you have somebody who should be in court as a war criminal is defined as a hero. What did Assange do? There should be 10,000 people here, maybe tomorrow there will be, expressing gratitude to Julian. We've already referred to the 2010 collateral damage cable video which showed 12 people being murdered in the street in a Baghdad suburb, murdered by Americans in an Apache helicopter who said, "Gee, man, this feels like a turkey shoot." He revealed to us the rules and the rationale for the torture of people in Guantanamo Bay and Camp Delta. He showed Tibetans fighting against the Chinese. He showed Russians spying on the cell phones of their own citizens. And of course, he had offended the big corporations, Barclays Bank, which had ripped off people to the tune of $1 billion, and he exposed the activities, or WikiLeaks did, of a security organization in Texas called Stratfor, which had been targeting activists in the Occupy movement and protesters against the Bhopal gas disaster. Let me finish now by trying to hear from some of the significant people who are trying to defend Julian Assange. Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer-winning journalist from the New York Times, says that, look, if you can't debate openly what's happening to Julian Assange, we're just going to be faced with a media that's full of propaganda, trivia, infotainment, and indoctrination. The indoctrination is going to mean that the people who expose the brutality of the state are really the enemies, when it should be the other way round. James Goodale, the brilliant lawyer who defended the New York Times and the Pentagon Papers case, said that this is a trampling on the First Amendment. This is the strangling of the rights of journalism as we know it. And the prestigious Columbia Journalism Review has more or less said the same thing. And that brave individual to whom we owe enormous gratitude, Chelsea Manning, refusing to testify against Julian, has said that the American government is taking a sword to stop the expose of the very institution, the Fourth Estate, which is meant to be defending human rights and liberties, freedom of the press, and free speech. Now, there's something significant about all those people I've just mentioned. None of them are Australians. None of them. I think, to his credit, the only politician who stuck his head above the trenches to protest about the concern with brutality, the concern with cruelty that is part of the American establishment happens to have been Bob Carr. This is a political issue. This is a public issue. It has nothing to do with the law. The law is a complete concoction. I've spent a lifetime in and out of British courts and American courts. It's a piece of theatre. They've concocted these charges. And I merely now finish by stressing what Linda stressed at the beginning, which is about the importance of a social movement to say enough is enough. Julian Assange is a brave, significant citizen to whom we should to whom we owe enormous gratitude. And I'll repeat what I said the last time I came here, which is to refer to the wonderful German poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht, who wrote essentially about the defense of Julian Assange. It was a poem called The Bread of the People, and he said, justice, our justice, your protest is the bread of the people. And like everyday bread, we should hear about justice every day from here on until Julian Assange is brought home and free. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful contribution. Our final speaker this afternoon is Nick Beams. Nick is a former National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party. He is a member of the World Socialist website International Editorial Board and writes regularly on global political economy and Australian and world history. Please welcome Nick Beams.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to the other speakers. Since the arrest of Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy on April 11, dragged off to London's Belmarsh prison, the attack on democratic rights by the United States and its allies has proceeded at an accelerating rate. And I want to emphasise that point. Because the unveiling of charges against Assange under the Espionage Act, with the prospect of still more to come, the imprisonment of Chelsea Manning for her courageous refusal to give false testimony against him, and the escalating torture of both of them have opened the way for sweeping attacks on journalism. The arrest of Assange, as other speakers have noted, has been followed by the raids on the offices of the ABC, the home of a News Limited journalist, and moves in France against journalists exposing the war crimes of the Macron government. There is a concerted and indeed accelerating campaign being waged by US imperialism and its allies. The Trump administration is seeking to abolish constitutional protections for free speech and is pushing others to do the same. It's highly significant that the head of the AFP, the Federal Police in Australia, revealed that the Australian raids were carried out to ensure the security of the Five Eyes network, the spying and intelligence operation involving the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. In other words, these raids were carried out not only on the orders from Canberra, but at the direction of Washington. What is to account for this mounting assault on fundamental democratic rights fought for and defended over centuries? What is the reason for the complete overturning, trampling on, destruction of democratic norms once regarded as sacrosanct and invoked even by the ruling classes themselves to provide the legitimacy for their rule? In short, what are the driving forces of this rapidly accelerating movement for ever more authoritarian and dictatorial forms of rule? The answer is not to be found in the psychology or mindset of individual capitalist politicians. It's to be found in objective conditions. And this is the source of the rampage against democratic rights. Assange and Manning have been targeted because they exposed war crimes, because they lifted the lid on the imperialist war machine and revealed to the world's people the truth of its operations. And for the ruling classes, that is a capital crime. They've been targeted because this machine is now gearing up for even greater depredations. It is threatening to plunge the world into conflagrations going even beyond the barbarism to which it was subjected in the first half of the 20th century. A sober, objective, in short, scientific examination reveals that the world is moving at an accelerating pace towards the eruption of a third world war involving the use of nuclear weapons, threatening the destruction of human civilization. I'm not exaggerating here. Rather, I am seeking to bring to your urgent attention hard, stubborn facts. Little more than a week ago, the world stood on the brink of a military catastrophe as the US set in motion an attack on Iran following the downing of a US drone by its missiles. The attack was only called off by Trump just 10 minutes before it was due to begin, with missiles ready to be fired and planes already in the air. Trump claimed he called it off because it would involve the death of 150 Iranians, and that was a disproportionate response to the downing of the drone. No one believes this, that the decision was reversed because the US, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands and the devastation inflicted on millions over the past quarter century, recognised that 150 lives were at risk. No, the real reason was the realisation, because of the downing of the drone, that Iran had the capacity to hit back, and that if it did, the US would respond, resulting in a rapid escalation that would lead inexorably to the involvement of other powers. Now, the war danger does not simply arise from Trump. There is an irrepressible impetus emanating from the highest levels of the US administration, as well as its military and intelligence establishment, for war. Trump himself has characterised his own national security advisor, John Bolton, as, and I quote, absolutely a hawk. And he said, if it was up to him, he'd take on the whole world at one time. Now, Trump's no doubt accurate characterisation of his own national security advisor, John Bolton, is instructive. It points to the objective driving forces behind the push to war. Let me outline those forces. The more than 3 decades-long conflict between the imperialist powers, the US, Britain, Japan, Germany, that is, the 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century, the death of millions, the rise of fascism, and horrors such as the Nazi Holocaust, was only brought to an end when the US established its supremacy in 1945, a supremacy emphasised by the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Japan. That supremacy, however, was not only based on military might, it also rested on economic power. The 7 decades since then have seen that power steadily erode. Consequently, US imperialism now sees itself confronted with enemies on all sides. Old rivals, Japan and Germany, and a new rival in the form of China. Faced with this situation, it has no intention of giving up its position of global dominance, but will rather seek to maintain it through military power, thereby threatening a new world war. Today, right now, as we gather here, the representatives of the G20 countries, the leaders of those countries, are meeting in Japan. The key item is the trade war launched against China by the US. But China is not the only target. Hanging over the heads of Germany and Japan is the threat of auto tariffs set to be imposed on national security grounds. The world is being dragged into a global economic conflict involving not only trade, but currencies and technology. Where is this leading? To the same destination as in the disastrous 1930s, when the economic conflicts of that decade resulted in the outbreak of war in September 1939. In 1934, in the midst of deepening trade war, the like of which we now see again, Leon Trotsky explained that the policies of national protectionism, in which each country placed itself first, were completely irrational from an economic standpoint. and irrationality magnified 1,000-fold in today's world of globalised production. But, he continued, those policies had a menacing reality insofar as it is a question of concentrating all the economic forces of the nation for the preparation of a new war. This work is proceeding now with full force. A new great war is knocking at the gates. Just 5 years later, it broke out. These issues are central to the campaign to free Assange and Manning as we go forward from this rally. Their incarceration and torture is the very centre, the spearhead of the drive by the US and other imperialist governments to impose dictatorship, crush all opposition as they prepare for war. Therefore, the world working class, the overwhelming mass of the population, must make the defence of Manning and Assange the focus of a great counter-offensive against dictatorship and war. There is deep-felt opposition to the attacks on Assange and Manning and sympathy for them. But that's not enough. This latent opposition must be transformed into an active, fighting political movement to secure their release. Now, how is that to be done? Above all, by explaining, by drawing the connection between the frame-up and incarceration of Assange and Manning, the drive to war, and all the great social and political issues now before working people the world over. There is a movement to the left among the broad mass of the world's people as they confront the accumulation of wealth on the heights of society as their own social position worsens. We must draw out for them that such a society in which social inequality has been raised to unprecedented heights is incompatible with democratic rights, and that to enforce this situation, the ruling classes are moving inexorably to dictatorial forms of rule. This means, and we must explain this, that for working people the world over, the fight for the freedom of Assange and Manning is inextricably linked to their fight for social and democratic rights. We must go forward to make these burning issues clear for ever wider sections of the population. Talk to your friends, your colleagues, your workmates. Use all the social media available to you to explain what is at stake. Above all, by circulating the daily articles on the World Socialist website. Join the Global Defence Committee, initiated by the International Committee of the Fourth International. We have no illusions about the situation we face. The forces arrayed against us are powerful and ruthless. There is nothing at which they will stop. There is no line they will not cross. But pessimism and demoralisation have no place here. Struggle will decide the issue, and a politically conscious and enlightened movement of the working class will prove to be far more powerful than all the agencies of imperialism. We must set our goals high. If 2 million people can come out on the streets of Hong Kong against extradition legislation, then surely we can fight to build a mass popular movement on a global scale to free Assange and Manning. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Before we conclude today's proceedings, I'd like to make a few announcements. Firstly, there will be a Sydney vigil to be held on Wednesday, July 3rd from 5:10 to 6:30 p.m. at Sydney Town Hall in honour of Julian Assange's birthday. And we urge everyone here to attend that event. Secondly, if you don't have a copy of the World Socialist website statement, the call for the Global Defence Committee, please take one from the bookstall. If you wish to participate in the Global Defence Committee, please take a sign-up form as well. So there are two things, the statement and a sign-up form for the Global Defence Committee to prevent Julian Assange's extradition to the United States. We will contact you very soon to discuss the development of this committee. Thirdly, I call on everyone here to donate generously to the Socialist Equality Party. The organisation of this worldwide initiative to prevent Julian Assange's extradition to the US will require resources, and we need to urgently raise whatever is necessary to take this fight forward immediately. Please give as much as you possibly can. We need to keep organising rallies, protests, meetings, conferences in order to bring together the best layers of the working class who are prepared to really commit to the fight to free Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. Fourth, we have attractive Julian Assange t-shirts for sale, beautifully modelled by several of our participants here, and they cost $15 each. We also have a great deal of socialist literature available, books and pamphlets, which we urge you to purchase and study. If you would like guidance as to what you should buy, just speak to one of the people at the stall. Finally, the SEP will be holding two other free Julian Assange rallies in the coming period. One in Brisbane next Saturday, July 6th at 12 noon at Redcliffe Place on the corner of George and Queen Streets in Brisbane, and in Melbourne on Sunday, July 14th at 2 p.m. at the State Library of Victoria on Swanson Street. If you have any friends, relatives who would be interested or whom you can interest in these rallies, please contact them and help us fight to build them. I'd like to now thank you very much for your attention and for your attendance. It's been a bit of a cold day, a bit of a wind came up, but everybody stayed and we really appreciate that. Now we all have to turn out to put into action the words and the commitments that we have heard here today. Thank you again very much, and we'll see you at the next rallies. Thank you.